I'm going to talk to you today, really start with a case study of my own, an experience that I've had recently. So I've done some work with the American Institute of Architects. It's the sort of the central professional organization for American architects. And they have a program called Future Forward, where they've been sort of looking at the future of architecture and focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. And one of their DEI officers came across my book, Intellectual Empathy, which came out in 2015, and was particularly interested in the content of the book that had to do with the relationship between logic, cognitive biases, and what I describe as the adversarial model of reasoning. And that was because her view and the view of folks working on the Future Forward initiatives was that there was sort of underlying approaches within the field that were affecting leadership in particular. And I'll talk a bit more about that. So they were concerned about questions about what constitutes ethical leadership. So the received model, as I understood it and as I started to learn more in architecture, and when I say received model, meaning this was not sort of formally instituted, but it was kind of inherited, passed on, part of the culture of architecture itself, is the great man theory of leadership, which many of you may be familiar with, established in the 19th century, most notably by philosopher and historian Thomas Carlyle. And the two main assumptions in the great man theory is that great leaders are born possessing certain traits that enable them to rise to leadership, so a kind of innate capacity for leadership, and that they can arise when most needed. And the great man theory sort of worked its way into things like the Encyclopedia Britannica, where stories were told from the perspectives of sort of single individuals rather than groups or collaborations for great historical achievements. I just want to make a note that Herbert Spencer, the Victorian philosopher sociologist, thought the theory was childish, primitive, and unscientific. So there was critical a critical account of the great man theory while it was still getting uptake in the 19th century. However, in architecture, the great man theory gained sort of new life in the work of Ayn Rand, and specifically in her novel, The Fountainhead. And if you're unfamiliar with the book or with Rand herself, she was a proponent of a view called objectivism. And the novel centers on an individualistic young architect who designs modernist buildings and refuses to compromise with the architectural establishment. Rand was fascinated with the work of Frank Lloyd Wright and sort of loosely based the character of Howard Rourke on Frank Lloyd Wright, who was known to say things like to those who lived in the homes that he built, there was the ceiling was dripping on the table, and Wright's comment was move your table, right? The architect and the design of the building and his vision was most important. And there was a film that followed the novel. It was hugely popular, and it infiltrated and permeated through the architecture field. Rand describes her own philosophy in an appendix to another novel, Atlas Shrugged, that her concept of man as a heroic being with his own happiness is the moral purpose of life, that reason is the only absolute. And just to note that this is not sort of just a mid-century view, and I'm not going to talk about Rand's philosophy or how it's impacted politics and in the United States. There's been uptake among libertarians and those on the right, but we'll focus on architecture for now. But just to note that John Gillis, a contemporary architect and one who is considered to be really one of the great American architects presently, dedicates his book to Aristotle and Ayn Rand as his two biggest influences. And he I just have a quote from him from an interview with him in April of 2019, just talking about the way in which Rand influenced him and how he read her book when he was 12, and he's never gotten over the power of the ideal man that she describes. He does say it could be a woman too, the ideal individual. So back to the case study. So the challenge for the future forward folks in the American Institute of Architects was, how do we handle the serious diversity problem that we are facing in architecture? So architecture, like my own field in philosophy, has a real diversity problem. Only 10 to 50% of women, and among the people of color, only 1 to 2% in the field of architecture. And there's real worry that architecture is dying. There's a whole host of reasons, which I can describe to you why architecture is so inaccessible for white women and for men and women of color. But for the purposes of today's talk, I'm just going to ask you to note that. So one of the things that the AIA decided to do was to invite 9 prominent architects of color from across the US to come together to look at these 2 questions. How do we diversify judgments about appearance and image? And I'll just note that this is a very visual field, so these are important issues and questions. But secondly, how can we prepare emerging ethnically and racially diverse leaders to meet professional expectations? And at the end of their work, among other things that they did, these 9 folks came up with a list of new leadership. And I'll share the list with you. They noted these 10 qualities. And if you peruse the list, you can see that they are quite different from the kind of great man theory or ideal man of reason. They're collaborative. They include things like a sense of wit, evidence of making people's lives better, generous. So how does this connect with Hume? And how did I get involved in this picture? Well, what the AIA asked me was, is there an ethical framework from the history of philosophy consistent with these attributes that came up from the working group that could help us craft a value statement? They wanted some sort of ethical underpinning. Of course, I initially went right to 20th century theories, the ethics of care, a feminist-based and responsibility and relationship-based view of ethics. I looked at communitarianism, utilitarianism, but I kept coming back to Hume, David Hume. Why? Hume is not known as a moral philosopher particularly. He's known for his work on induction, as well as his skeptical arguments around conceptions of reason. But in Hume's work, he really had 2 targets, and he was unique for his time in this way, that he was quite critical of the Socratic Platonic notion of innate ideas, and he was also very vocally critical of theistic models of divine command theory, that kings, for instance, are divinely commanded to rule. And he was an outspoken atheist for his time as well. But those were really his 2 targets: innate and absolute ideas and theistic models. And Hume argues against what he calls artificial virtues. And as I said, his moral theory is not the thing he's most known for. But I kept coming back to this list that he targets, and it looks like my time is running out. So I'll just share the list. He calls these the monkish virtues. And instead, he argues for these virtues, what he calls the natural virtues. And if you look at that list and you remember the list that the 9 folks in the working group came up with, there are parallels. And so it was very surprising to me to think that maybe the ethical underpinning here might be Hume. And I'll just leave you with 2 wonderful quotes that Hume provides about his moral theory. He says the traditional virtues stupefy the understanding and harden the heart. And if we think of the great man, Hume could have the great man theory as a target. And finally, he says a gloomy, harebrained enthusiast after his death may have a place in the calendar of history, but will scarcely, when alive, be admitted into the intimacy of social engagement, except by those as delirious and as dismal as themselves. So Hume teaching us that the great man maybe is not the way for us to go, and that we can think about communal values as real moral virtues. Thank you.